I'm Sam Kimball. Canada's Midwest burned after the federal election. The federal election was one of the worst results possible for Canada's Midwest. We say Midwest because we don't want to offend BC's lower mainland. The results of which increases alienation while shackling the country to a federal government apathetic to the concerns of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and most of British Columbia. The federal election was the catalyst, but the roots of alienation run deeper. It's based not in anger, but rather fear. The media has missed that point. Fear doesn't go away until the cause of the fear goes away. The passing of Bills C-69 and C-48, while ignoring industry, provinces, and Senate concerns, the Trans Mountain debacle, and campaigning against the oil industry by the Liberals, NDP, and Green Party didn't help. Rather than focus on the real driver of emissions, that being the demand side of fossil fuels, progressive entities choose regulations that attack almost exclusively Canada's supply side. While it seems more politically saleable to attack Canada's energy industry, the supply versus the demand, it only means that more carbon intensive and less environmentally regulated and less human rights friendly barrels of oil will be purchased in lieu of ours, as demand remains intact. Federally, what the centre-right movement in Canada has done has not worked, and Conservatives lost the election because they deserved to lose. Having said that, it is tough to knock a Prime Minister out of office in a second term from a majority situation. And through little to no credit given to his opponents, Trudeau as a leader and his brand is ruined just by being himself. His credibility is shattered. This is self-imposed, everlasting harm. Canadians will just never look at him the same way again, and this includes liberal-leaning Canadians. Historically, no minority government has lasted more than 2 years in Canada, so history suggests Canadians will be back at the polls in relatively short order. A strategy based on hoping Jagmeet Singh splits the left is not a strategy. The NDP has all but abandoned private sector working families and are not the force they once were. Regardless, the center-right parties need to do more than the above, much more. I don't think I'm alone in saying this past election, I didn't feel like I had a home with any of the options presented. A credible, balanced, but fiscally responsible option did not truly exist for Canadians in this election. Big C Conservatives need to rethink their policy to align with the larger tent of Canadians. Get credible on climate. Get clear on social conservative policy. On social conservative policy, establish that personally held beliefs are none of our business, and commit to bar against any regressive social conservative policy development. For climate, practical legislation can be introduced for climate and economic impact assessments. Get more serious about climate. Most conservative-leaning voters are waiting for proof of life on this file. And torque down the attack on carbon pricing. It's getting to be an eye roll. Some don't believe fiscal conservatism sells outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan. But looking at the nation, we see 7 provincial governments that are conservative-leaning. With coordination, they could be quite effective in reducing or mitigating the harm to Canada's Midwest. Harms that arise from a federal government intentionally obtuse to the interests of citizens residing in resource-rich areas of the country. So while Premier Jason Kenney took some heat for this, Alberta needs to continue to coordinate with a coalition of like-minded provinces. Premier, please keep chartering planes. Premier Kenney is not a Redford or Lukaszuk, and a business meeting in Saskatoon is not the same as a family getaway in Jasper. Keep chartering planes as required. I saw that as a fantastic use of taxpayer funds. With Jason Kenney's leadership, alliances can be forged, notably in Ontario, many of whom who are sympathetic to Alberta and Saskatchewan. The cost of living and fighting high taxes is a message that resonates in Ontario. And many in Ontario remember that when auto and manufacturing was down, Alberta industry stepped in to offer employment through fly-in, fly-out programs, even fighting on Ontario residents' behalf when OHIP cut their health benefits for working out of province. I must say this was a real slow clap movement by some of the same operatives now involved with the federal Liberal Party. For a time, certain projects actually had temporary foreign workers with better access to Canadian health coverage than Ontario residents working on the job until we fix that. Alberta was and is on the side of working families across the country. And Bay Street is heavily invested in resource extracting industries in Canada. There is plenty of mutual interest in seeing Canada's Midwest thrive. Ontario is generally an ally to Alberta and Saskatchewan. People do care, but those voices are often drowned out by urban megacenters in Ontario and Quebec. And this leads us to facing the fact that part of the problem for Canada's Midwest is structural. Resource-poor, vote-rich urban centers are at odds with sparsely populated but resource-rich areas of the country. The Liberals and NDP promise voters something for nothing via a wealth distribution from the resource-rich regions to vote-rich regions. Under a Liberal and NDP-like coalition, with this calculus, the federal government ends up being the promise makers and intentionally makes Canada's Midwest the promise keepers or payers. And under recent progressive regimes, Canada's Midwest is essentially colonized by urban Ontario and Quebec. As long as demographic and electoral numbers remain the same, this will continue to be a challenge. Mind you, the Midwest doesn't begrudge entirely of being assigned the role of promise keepers. We love the opportunity to flex, to enterprise, and to rise to the challenge. To bet against Canada's entrepreneurial spirit is not a good bet to make. But we want the federal government to get out of the way. Stop with the roadblocks, the interference, the disproportionate attack of the industries that help fund the country's social programs. What's our 50%? Well, for Alberta, it has to get its own house in order. And it is taking important steps to reduce our spending profile while continuing to diversify. There is a tremendous value-add political agenda underway in Alberta. While outcomes lag, as the province recovers from 4 years of NDP rule, it is doing the right thing. Hope and energy is returning to working families across the province. Alberta's Fair Deal panel announcement comes at the perfect time. It allays fears that feed fringe movements and opportunism, such as Wexit, and reaches out to the federal government by signaling meaningful pathways to healing. Also important, its message are echoed by Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Quebec to a degree. The federal government ought not ignore these overtures, or there is a risk of further unhelpful and divisive sentiment. This is not about separation or alienation. It's sadly about healing from fear and restoring fairness. All this driven by a fear and an unfairness created by a federal government whose self-serving calculus involved benefiting themselves by dividing Canadians. Canadians need to develop their own alliances, continue to reach out to the rest of the Federation, refrain from blaming other Canadians, and stay focused on winning the next election, whatever that means for you. In the meantime, balance and a conscious decision to remain positive and hopeful will go a long way for working families caught in the middle. To Canada's working families, all the best to you as you navigate these currently unsettled waters. All things change, and remember that you are not alone. Signing off, this is Sam Kemble.